Okay, so ready to dive into something a little different today?
Always.
Okay, good. We all know Hitler, right?
Yeah.
I mean, as the dictator, a figure of immense evil. But have you ever thought about the young Hitler? Like, before the war, before the world knew him?
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about, isn't it?
It is, because apparently he wasn't always plotting world domination. He actually wanted to be an artist. So today we're going to go on this deep dive into the art of Adolf Hitler. You sent over some sources, and we're going to really dig in.
Sounds intriguing, to say the least.
It is. It's a little unsettling, too. But, okay, so 1907, 18-year-old Hitler moves to Vienna, and he is determined to make it as a painter. Now, Vienna back then wasn't just any city, right? It was like the place for art and culture.
Oh, absolutely. It was a major center.
So to make it there, that must have been like the dream.
For sure. I mean, the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, where Hitler applied, that was the place to be.
Like the Harvard of art schools.
Exactly. If you got in there, you were considered like one of the best, the most promising young artists in all of Europe.
Wow. Okay, so young Hitler, full of ambition, applies and gets rejected.
Yeah.
Not once, but twice.
Ouch.
Yeah. And apparently figure drawing was a weakness for him, which I always found interesting because, well, later on he becomes obsessed with these perfect human forms, the whole Aryan ideal and everything.
It is kind of a curious connection, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah. The sources definitely suggest that this rejection from the academy really hit him hard.
Yeah, I can imagine.
He was young, so full of himself, and then bam, this major blow to his ego.
So what does he do? Does he pack up and go home?
No, he actually stays in Vienna.
Yeah.
Tries to make a go of it, scraping by, selling postcards to tourists and paintings.
But he never really makes it, does he?
No, not really. The sources all describe his work as pretty uninspired, even, well, mediocre.
So was he just not that talented? Or was Vienna just that competitive? Like, were there a lot of other artists trying to make it?
Oh, yeah. The art scene in Vienna was definitely a tough one to crack. But the sources also point out that that his art lacked a certain depth. It was like he was painting the surface of things, buildings, landscapes, but not really capturing the essence underneath.
Interesting. So even in his art, there was this focus on outward appearances. Like, he was more into a kind of superficial grandeur
Yeah.
rather than anything deeper.
Usually say that, yeah.
And it makes you wonder, right? Because later on, he's all about power and these big spectacles. So maybe those tendencies, they were already there.
Yeah, maybe. It's fascinating to think about.
It is. So what was he actually painting? Like, what subjects?
Mostly landscapes, architectural scenes, and some still lifes. Pretty traditional stuff, actually.
Okay.
But there are some recurring themes that stand out. He was drawn to these grand buildings, especially the ones with historical significance, like the Vienna Opera House or castles, palaces, that kind of thing.
So even in his subjects, there's that hint of ambition, right? The fascination with power and grandeur.
Definitely. And it goes beyond that. There's a strong emphasis on Germanic history and mythology, too. One source mentioned a painting of a scene from the Nibelungenlied, which is this classic epic poem. It was often used, to kind of stir up German nationalism.
So it's like, even back then, he was maybe unconsciously tapping into those ideas that would later become the foundation of his whole ideology.
Exactly. And it's not just the subjects, but how he painted them. There's this rigidity, this lack of warmth in his style. It's like he was trying to impose order on everything, even in his art.
Wow.
Remember, this was all before he got into politics.
Crazy. Okay, we've talked about the buildings, the history, but what about his actual style? Like, how did he paint? What does that tell us about him?
It's almost like he was afraid of anything too emotional, too real, He preferred these idealized forms. Like, he was trying to create this world where everything was perfect, orderly, under control. And that wasn't just the subject matter, it was his technique, too. Like, his brushstrokes, they were always so tight, so controlled.
So even his technique reflects that desire for control.
Yeah, like he was trying to build this wall between himself and real human emotion, the messy stuff.
It's like he was building his own fortress way before the bunkers and the war and all that.
Yeah.
So we've got this guy avoiding depth in his art, and the sources say he was pretty isolated in his life too.
Yeah, right. Even though he was living in Vienna, surrounded by people, he didn't have many friends. Rarely went out. Preferred to be alone.
So we're seeing those same patterns in his art and his life. Makes you think, doesn't it?
It does. It seems like Like, this isolation, combined with his artistic frustrations, probably played a big role in shaping how he saw the world.
It's crazy how those little details, those personal struggles, they can, like, snowball, right, and end up impacting history.
Absolutely. And in Hitler's case, those early struggles were really tied up with his artistic ambitions.
So we're talking Vienna. Big dreams, harsh realities, a whole lot of potential, but not really going anywhere.
Yep.
So what happens next? Does he give up on art? Like, just dive headfirst into politics?
Not exactly. It's a bit more complicated than that. And actually, the next chapter is even more interesting because that's where we start to see his art and his political ambitions really start to come together.
Well, now I'm on the edge of my seat. But I think we should probably save that for part 2 of our deep dive.
Yeah, good idea.
You've given us, and hopefully our listeners, a lot to think about already.
Lots to unpack. In part 2, we'll see how Hitler's art actually evolved, how it got all mixed up with his ideology, and how he used it, basically, to try to reshape the world.
Wow. Can't wait.
So, welcome back to our deep dive into Hitler's art. Last time we were talking about the young Hitler in Vienna, right? All those frustrations. But these early experiences, they don't just fade away.
Right. And that's what's so crazy about all of this. It's like we're tracing the steps of how, a monster is made.
Yeah. So in 1913, Hitler leaves Vienna and moves to Munich.
Okay.
Now, this move is important for a couple of reasons. One, it's like a shift for him, He's not really focused on art as a career anymore. It's more like things are becoming more ideological for him.
Interesting. So less about painting pretty pictures and more about...
And the second thing is Munich back then was, it was like the center of German nationalism. So it was almost like stepping into this echo chamber for all the resentment and frustration he'd been carrying around.
So instead of struggling artists, he's now surrounded by, like, political radicals?
Exactly. And remember, this is right before World War I. Germany's about to go through some major upheaval. There's this feeling in the air, like this nationalistic pride, but also a lot of anger about losing the previous war.
Yeah, I can imagine. So, like, all the ingredients for a really bad situation are starting to come together. But what about his art? Is he still painting at this point?
He is, but it's different now. The sources suggest that his artistic ambitions, they kind of take a back seat to his political obsessions. He's going to rallies, reading all this political stuff, and getting caught up in the rhetoric of, groups that basically preach German superiority and racial purity.
Yikes. So his art, it's less about, expressing himself and more about reflecting those ideologies.
Yeah, you could say that. His paintbrush almost becomes like a tool for propaganda.
Wow. So those grand buildings and historical scenes he loved before, they take on a whole new meaning.
Exactly. They become these symbols of German power and dominance.
So his style actually changed as he got more political.
Not the style itself so much, but definitely the intent. The way he presented these images became more deliberate, more about getting a specific reaction from people. He was surrounded by people using language to manipulate and inspire. So it makes sense that would start to influence how he saw the power of images too.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's like he's taking those same techniques of persuasion and applying them to his art. But did he actually use his paintings as propaganda? Like, were they displayed publicly?
That's where the sources get a little fuzzy, but they do mention that Hitler was trying to get recognized, not just as a painter, but as someone who could visually capture, the spirit of this new Germany he was dreaming of.
So even then, he's trying to control the narrative to shape how people see things. And art is his tool. It's like we're seeing the early version of his propaganda machine.
Exactly. And as we know, he eventually becomes a master propagandist. But what's interesting is that it all started with his art.
Right. Way before the radio broadcasts and the rallies and all of that. Okay, so let's jump ahead a bit. We know he eventually becomes chancellor. What happens to his art then? Does he keep painting?
He does, but it becomes even more, overtly political.
I bet.
The sources describe these later paintings as being really idealized, almost like a utopia,
Utopia, like what?
Strong, healthy Aryan families working the land, these huge monuments to German achievements, scenes of national unity and prosperity. It's like he was painting the world as he wished it was, not how it actually was.
So it's art as, like, wish fulfillment.
Pretty much. And we can't forget, all of this is happening while the Nazis are persecuting Jews, political opponents, anyone they didn't see as fitting into this perfect German society.
God, It's like this horrible contrast, right? These idyllic scenes on canvas and then the reality of concentration camps and genocide.
Yeah, it's like his art becomes this distorted mirror reflecting this warped reality that he wants to create.
It's disturbing.
For sure. And it raises a lot of questions about art and ideology, how art can be used to, inspire but also deceive.
So what about Hitler's art today? What should we do with it? Is it even right to think of it as art?
That's the big debate, right? Some people think it should all be destroyed, like it's too toxic. Others say it has historical value, that it helps us understand, how he thought, how his ideology developed.
I can see both sides. I mean, it's hard to separate the art from the artist, especially in this case.
Yeah.
But studying his art, seeing how it reflected his twisted worldview, maybe that could help us prevent something like this from happening again.
Right. It's tough. No easy answers. But what's clear is that Hitler's art, from those early days in Vienna to the propaganda pieces, it gives us this really unique and disturbing look into the mind of one of history's worst figures.
All right, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Hitler's art. We've talked about those early years in Vienna, the propaganda, the whole idealized Germany thing. But what happened to all those paintings after the war? Like, did they just vanish?
Well, not exactly. It's a bit of a weird situation, actually. I mean, Hitler's art became this, kind of uncomfortable legacy. Some of it was destroyed during the war, of course, bombings, fires. But you'd be surprised how much actually survived.
Really? So where is it all now? Like, in museums? Private collections?
Some of it is kept in government archives, like tucked away in storage. They're not exactly putting it on display,
Mm-hmm.
And some pieces did end up in private collections, but those sales, they're usually, kept pretty hush-hush. Not exactly something you brag about at a dinner party.
Yeah, come see my Hitler painting. Not exactly a conversation starter.
Right. And that brings up a really tricky question. What do we do with Hitler's art? Like, is it even right to call it art, considering, everything he did?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's hard to separate the art from the artist. But then again, maybe these paintings, even though they're disturbing, maybe they can teach us something.
That's what some people argue, yeah. They say these works, they offer a glimpse into Hitler's mind, his worldview. Like maybe by studying his art, we can understand, how fascism takes root, how propaganda works, how evil can just kind of grow.
Yeah, I get that. But it still feels wrong to, profit from his work in any way.
Yeah.
Like putting it on display. Even if it's for educational purposes, it almost feels like you're giving him a platform.
I hear you. It's a complex issue. No easy answers. I think each person, each society has to kind of wrestle with that and decide what feels right.
So we end up with this weird legacy, right? These objects from such a dark time, these echoes of this man who tried to reshape the world through violence and in a way through art. I don't know. It's a lot to wrap your head around. And it brings us back to that big question we started with.
Yeah.
What can we learn from all this? What's the point of this whole deep dive?
Well, I think one thing we can take away is just how powerful art can be. Hitler's art, maybe it wasn't, technically brilliant or anything, but it was effective. He knew how to use images to stir up emotions, to bring back memories, to change how people saw things. And he used all of that to spread his hateful ideology.
It's kind of scary to think about. Like art in the wrong hands, it really can be dangerous.
It can, but there's another lesson here too, I think. It's about understanding where evil comes from. We traced Hitler's journey. We saw how his ambitions, his frustrations, his need for control, how all of that fed into his political goals. And I think that gives us some insight into, what creates a monster.
Right. And maybe by understanding that, we can learn to spot the warning signs earlier, the little changes in thinking and behavior that can lead to something really bad.
Exactly.
It makes you realize that tyranny, it can start anywhere, even in the mind of an artist who just wants to be recognized,
Yeah, it's a sobering thought.
It is. But I think this whole deep dive, it also makes me appreciate art even more. I mean, it can inspire, it can challenge, it can provoke, it can manipulate. It's up to us as viewers to be aware of that, to really think critically, to question things.
Yeah, absolutely. We have to engage with art actively, not just passively absorb it.
Right. And by understanding Hitler's art, all the good and bad, all the beauty and ugliness, I think we can better understand, the forces that shape our world, both the good ones and the bad ones.
Well said.
This has been a really eye-opening journey. I have to admit, when we started, I wasn't quite sure what to expect. But this has definitely given me a new perspective on Hitler, on art, on history, on everything. And it's left me with a lot to think about.
I'm glad to hear that. And hopefully it will encourage our listeners to keep exploring, to keep asking questions. The more we understand about the past, the better equipped we are to deal with the present and the future.
That's a great point. So until our next deep dive, everyone keep learning, keep thinking critically, and keep those minds open.
Absolutely. Thanks for listening.